This is where Thomas Becket was murdered. And the story of Thomas Becket is that he worked for the king, King Henry II. He was his chancellor, he looked after the money. And he and the king decided that the king was too poor and the church was very rich, because the church had money, owed a lot of land, and people who farmed on the land owned by the church had to pay what they call a tithe, 10% of their income they had to pay to the church. So the church was very rich, and of course Canterbury was even richer because people came here as pilgrims, and they had to pay money to survive and to pay to the church for their miracles. So Henry II and Thomas Becket decided that if some of the money didn't go directly to Rome but stayed in Britain, then the king would feel himself better. And so he and Becket hatched a plot, and the plot was that Becket should be ordained a priest. He was ordained a priest one day, and rapid promotion was made Archbishop of Canterbury the following day. So you go from nothing to everything in one day. But pretty soon after Becket was made the Archbishop of Canterbury, he started to see more of the church's side of the argument. And he started to become more pious and to think about the church more. So he and the king began to argue. And the argument got so severe that Becket feared for his life. So he went into exile into the west of France, to a monastery called Montrevoux. And he stayed in Montrevoux for 6 years. And for 6 years, emissaries were going backwards and forwards trying to solve the problem. And after 6 years, they signed a compact, and they thought the problem was solved. They were wrong. So Becket came back to Canterbury in November 1170, and he was here when the king talked to his courtiers and his knights and said words that you see in books and films: "Who will rid me of this turbulent priest?" And 4 knights put up their hands and said they'd do it. So they came to Canterbury. Apparently the court was actually in the west of France at that time, so they came to Canterbury across the sea, and that can't have been very pleasant in November in a sailing ship. But they arrived here in their armour with their swords, and they came here to attack Thomas Becket. So at about 5 o'clock in the evening on the 29th of December 1170, Becket came into the cathedral for evening prayers for Vespers, and he was followed by the 4 knights. Now I always say, one of the monks tried to lock the doors, but Becket wouldn't allow the doors to be locked. He said it's the house of God, it's open to everyone. But he also could have hidden. I mean, it's a big place. And on the 29th of December, it's black. If you don't have any electricity, you've only got candles, it would be easy to hide, but he didn't. And so he came into about here. At that time, there was a pillar just about where that black tombstone is, because there's a chapel above, St. Blaise's Chapel. And he was followed by the 4 knights who attacked him in a very brutal way. And they hit him so hard that he tried to stay upright for as long as he could against the pillar, but it was no use. He was murdered. One of them hit him so hard that he broke his sword. One of them hit him so hard that he chopped the top of his head off. And this is a modern altar called the Altar of the Sword Point. And if you see the 2 swords on the side in metal hanging, and behind them the 2 shadows, and they represent the 4 knights who murdered him here. The central cross is a sword with a broken handle, and you could also say there are the 3 crosses on the head of Calvary. So it has many different meanings, and it's a very powerful altar, I think. It's not so effective if the electricity isn't on. Okay, so you can also see here that having been murdered here, this is obviously a very holy place. So people who were either considered to be holy themselves or had enough money could ask to be buried here. Over there you see the sort of gaps in the stone. That's where brass used to be, but it didn't disappear in the 1960s or 70s when people did lots of brass rubbing. It disappeared in the 1700s, because in the 1700s the city decided that they were feeling very poor and the church was very rich, so they stole it. We keep things, we don't restore, we don't make it like new. We think it's important to keep the history of the cathedral as it was. Before we go up, would you just look behind you at that row of stained glass? That is the person who is, the man with his crown on who is facing to the east, which is that way, is King Edward IV. Behind him, their sons, the two princes. Two princes were murdered in the Tower of London. And opposite him is Elizabeth Woodville, his queen. She's the White Queen. And behind her are their 5 daughters. The eldest daughter married the man who is to become Henry VII. There's a lot of English history in this cathedral. So, let's go up and we're going to see the ceiling of the tower. Please don't look up at the ceiling when you're going up the steps. Please look when you're either at the bottom of the steps or the top of the steps. It makes me nervous. So let's go.